Today, we're revisiting the most astounding instances in which singers were fired by bands in the 1970s. And some of these still hurt, believe me. Ozzy Osbourne, Black Sabbath. Music, applause. I'm willing to wager that most of us immediately picture Ozzy's voice from Iron Man or Paranoid when we hear the word Black Sabbath. In the early 1970s, you could hear that sound everywhere on FM radio, coming from your friend's vehicle speakers, and bouncing off the walls at parties where the volume knob was never turned down again. Ozzy was simply Sabbath. There was no one else who could roar and snarl like that. Furthermore, heavy metal seemed to have been created overnight at the time. By the end of the decade, however, Ozzy was partying more than he was playing, since his wild side didn't only stay on stage. His crazy bandmates were unable to keep up. And when a crazy band from the 1970s tells you that you're a little too much, you may need to pull yourself together. So, they performed the unimaginable in 1979. Their own frontman was dismissed. Oddly enough, that worked out. I recall thinking when I read it, how do you fire Ozzy from Black Sabbath? That's like firing thunder from a storm. While Ozzy quickly recovered with Blizzard of Oz and delivered us Crazy Train, Sabbath continued with Ronnie James Dio and sounded brand new. In retrospect, it may have been one of the few splits when both parties were able to go on. Life was once more annihilated by Genesis' Peter Gabriel. Where else do they play? Genesis provided us with the progressive rock theater, but Black Sabbath gave us the sound of heavy metal. Peter Gabriel was that theater. You never knew what to expect when Gabriel took the stage in the early 70s. He would have a flower sprouting out of his brain one night, followed by a fox wearing a red dress or some other bizarre figure telling a 20-minute epic. Concerts seemed more like an odd, otherworldly play than concerts. He was once described by Melody Maker as the surrealist equivalent of Mick Jagger. In order to find out what costume he would come up with next, fans would peruse the periodicals. Furthermore, Genesis was initially as much a visual as a sound experience. It wasn't all fun, though, inside the band. The rest of Genesis, who thought the music was being overshadowed by the spectacles, frequently fought with Gabriel's wild imagination and flair for drama. Now my comfort will come. Tensions were at an all-time high by the time they performed The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway in 74-75. You see, the album was a huge project, and Gabriel's intricate story and characters took center stage. Gabriel himself subsequently stated, quote, "I didn't feel like I could be a normal member of the group anymore." Phil Collins later acknowledged, quote, "We felt like passengers on Peter's trip." As a result, he left by August 1975. Fans and critics knew the breakup was coming, but the official reason was to spend more time with family. Many believed that without him, Genesis wouldn't be able to survive. Gabriel was, after all, the band's spectacle, voice, and face. As stated by Rolling Stone, losing him would be like saying, yes, without John Anderson, or The Who without Daltrey. However, there was a twist. Phil Collins seized the microphone after emerging from behind the drums. Genesis sounded less dramatic and leaner at first. Music, however, the group gradually developed into one of the most popular rock groups of the late 1970s and early 1980s. They substituted radio hits like Invisible Touch for the bizarre plots and costumes. Gabriel's Genesis, however, will always be the definitive version for ardent prog fans. They became stadium kings thanks to their later smashes. However, Genesis was more than just a band in those early 1970s performances, when Gabriel told wild stories and wore outrageous costumes. Performance art was what it was. And when he departed, that magic left with him. Indeed, John Anderson. His moment was captured by music. Man, without John Anderson's voice floating over the top, those early Yes records simply wouldn't have been the same. I've seen All Good People roundabout. The band seemed to be from another world because of his high, airy voice. Yes, their lengthy tunes, crazy artwork, and cosmic words were already an adventure. However, Anderson's vocals brought everything together. However, musical harmony did not equate to band harmony. And by 1979, arguments over finances, touring, and their future course eventually came to a climax. And Anderson got the boot right alongside Rick Wakeman. Music, isn't that unbelievable? The man who said yes was fired. Yes, they continued with different singers, but the magic was gone for me and many of my followers. Even though Anderson later returned, his firing in the late 70s remains one of the most bizarre decisions in prog rock history. Pink Floyd, Syd Barrett. Music. Okay, let's discuss the band that helped define the 1970s and the specter that followed them. Alright, you're correct. In 1968, Syd Barrett formally left the company. However, his story is inextricably linked to the band's 70s popularity that it is impossible to separate the two. Syd wasn't merely a singer. He was the initial visionary of the band. He was the author of such oddball psychedelic masterpieces as See Emily Play and Arnold Lane. It was more than simply music when you listened to those tunes on the radio in the past. It was a journey into an odd, fantastical realm. However, the intensely bright light began to waver. Syd's already brittle mind vanished into a haze driven by acid. Stories from that time period seem less like band practice and more like a horror film. Roger Waters reportedly recounted a performance in which Syd simply stood on stage with his guitar dangling from his neck, staring into space. The band, including his friend David Gilmour, who'd been brought in to cover for him, was forced to make a difficult decision. They just stopped taking him to performances. I understand that you're being tough, but what will you do? They never really left Syd behind, even though they went on to become the decade's stadium rock icons. His flameouts tragedy and genius became the focus of their artwork. Wish You Were Here is a straightforward and moving ode to him. Man, I might touch you, but I won't. The tune Shine on You Crazy Diamond and the famous song of the same name are heartbreaking depictions of a buddy who has passed away. Gilmour himself stated, quote, "It's the ultimate what if." The band's transformation from an eccentric psychedelic group to a worldwide sensation was driven by the sadness of losing their main influence. You can't help but think of the brilliant spark who lighted the fuse and then burned out far too soon every time you hear those initial notes. Give Peter Criss a Kiss. Music. When you think about Kiss, you can't help but think of Peter Criss, the psycho behind the drums. His raspy voice on Beth in 1976, which became one of their biggest singles, was the first time Kiss revealed a softer side to many of us. At a school dance, do you recall slow dancing to that song? Overhead, a disco ball spinning? It wasn't precisely the blood spinning, fire-breathing Kiss that most people had in mind, but that's what made it so memorable. Music. Despite all that glitz and glamour, Peter gave the band some heart, but by the late 1970s, to put it mildly, things were falling apart. Chris's drug usage, conflicts with the others, and deteriorating drumming were causing session musicians to fill in on the records. The band finally severed their relationship with Dynasty and the disco-tinged song I Was Made for Loving You in 1980. Baby, I was created to love you. Behind the paint, Kiss continued with fresh faces. You Were Me. Let's face it, though, for people who grew up with the original four, life never felt quite the same once Peter left. We just missed that cool cat. David Heap Uriah Byron. Who can recall the sound of Easy Life coming from early 1970s vehicle stereos and jukeboxes? Uriah Heep was right there in the heavy rock discourse, even though they may never have achieved the Zeppelin or Purple levels. And David Byron played a significant role in that. His voice soared over those thunderous chords and whirling Hind organ lines, and it was not just powerful, it was theatrical, almost operatic. One moment he might seem like an angel, the next he might sound menacing. But as legendary as that voice was, Byron himself was becoming unpredictable. His drinking began to seep into the studio sessions, live performances, and even rehearsals. Music, applause, music. Later, guitarist Mick Box said, quote, "It broke our hearts. He was one of the best singers we ever had, but we couldn't carry on like that." Music. By 1976, the band members had decided to ruthlessly fire him. Officially, it was musical differences, but fans knew what was actually happening. Losing Byron was a shock to the listeners. Uriah Heep was the voice. His replacement, according to critics at the time, would be similar to Deep Purple without Ian Gillan. Spiritually impossible, but technically feasible. With new vocalists like John Lton and Bernie Shaw, Uriah Heep did persevere. But for many admirers, the Byron era will always be the quintessential one. I'm trying to find you. Music, unfortunately, his narrative ended badly. Byron's career as a solo artist never really took off. And at the age of 38, he passed away in 1985 from difficulties brought on by alcohol. But even now, you can recall why he was important by listening to Gypsy or July Morning. That voice was primal, dramatic, and unforgettable. It was like lightning in a bottle. And Uriah Heep was never the same after it was gone. Dave Evans, AC/DC. Music, now, this is a name that many people overlook. AC/DC's first singer was Dave Evans. Yep. Evans was the guy in front of them before Bon Scott appeared and gave them the growling voice we all recognize from Highway to Hell and High Voltage. From their debut hit, Can I Sit Next to You Girl, he served as their frontman. In 1974. Now, the biggest difficulty was Evans never fully clicked with the rest of the group. The connection simply wasn't there, and he wasn't a huge fan of the rugged working-class image the Young brothers desired. The band fired him by the end of '74 and replaced him with Bon Scott. Of course, the rest is history. It turned out to be their best decision ever. However, the idea that AC/DC began with a completely different voice is still astounding. It's similar to learning that a different lead actor nearly starred in your favorite television program. It alters your perception of the beginning. For example, what if Michael Scott was actually Bob Saget and not Steve Carell? What do you know? Indeed, I would continue to watch that Office. I would still watch it. Ian Gillan, Deep Purple. Music, the band that provided us with the riff comes next. Around the world, people heard the riff. Deep Purple. Of course, everyone is familiar with Smoke on the Water's opening. However, without Ian Gillan's vocals, that song wouldn't qualify as a rock anthem. He did more than just sing. He let out a cry. He could cut through the fiercest guitar solos with his guttural, impossible-to-hear scream. You knew precisely what to expect when you dropped the needle on Machine Head during a party. Rock and roll that is loud, angry, and unrestrained. Your folks were hammering on the ceiling to the music. However, a band with a lot of talent usually has even bigger egos in rock and roll, and Deep Purple was no different. There's music in the air. The ongoing conflict between Gillan and guitarist Ritchie Blackmore was now the primary issue. Offstage, the two were like water and oil, but together they were a sonic force. There was a noticeable tension. Gillan initially resigned in 1973 due to exhaustion from the constant touring and combat. As a fan, it was never the same, even though the band continued to play with changing lineups. In the mid-1980s, Gillan unexpectedly returned to the band for a reunion album. However, that renowned chemistry had long since vanished. A renowned rock journalist once observed that their relationship was like a powder keg that was about to blow up. Gillan rejoined the group. Cheers! However, the ancient rivalries have now resurfaced with a vengeance. In 1989, following several turbulent years, he was abruptly dismissed. For many fans, it was just another slap in the face of a band that was well known to them. And the argument over the best lineup continues to this day. But for the majority of us who grew up with them, Ian Gillan's thunderous, sky-piercing scream will always be the quintessential Deep Purple sound. Dennis D. Styx. Youthful. Music, Dennis D. Young was leading the charge for Styx, and if you switched on the radio in the late 70s, you probably heard his voice. Lady Babe, Come Sail Away. Styx stood out from all the other arena rock bands of the time thanks to his dramatic theatrical sound. Do you recall the first time you heard The Grand Illusion on vinyl? It was fantastic. Styx got their personality from D. Young. Part Broadway musical, part rock band. The timeline becomes complex at this point. Since Styx has had such a significant role in the 70s scene, it's worth discussing even though D. Young wasn't officially pushed out until the 1980s. Music, the 1970s were undoubtedly the time when the seeds of this depressing fallout were sown. Some of the band members had grown weary of his ballads and extravagant production technique by the turn of the decade. Additionally, many admirers found the breakup to be unpleasant. It broke my heart. Without his voice, Styx would be impossible to imagine. Without Dennis D. Young, Styx seems to me like a jukebox with half of its buttons missing. It will play, of course, but it won't sound good. Lou Gramm, a foreigner. Music. Who among us didn't have the song Hot-Blooded or Feel Like stuck in our heads from the late 70s? There were foreigners everywhere. And don't worry about Lou Gramm's voice. Gritty when the song called for it, smooth when he wanted to be. His unique combination of strength and soul was able to break through the cacophony. In roughly 5 seconds of Double Vision, you can hear why Rolling Stone referred to him as one of the best rock singers of the time. Here's the twist now. It's true that Lou wasn't dismissed in the 1970s. Alongside the foreigner, he rode shotgun during their monstrous run. Waiting for a Lady Like You, Music, Cold as Ice, Urgent, and all the way to I Want to Know What Love Is. However, things became somewhat disorganized by the late 1980s and early 1990s. While Mick Jones was pursuing that polished, radio-friendly sound, Lou wanted the band to return to its hard rock beginnings. At one point, Lou remarked, quote, "I was feeling like a sideman in my own band." The tension finally broke, and Graham left in the early 1990s. To many fans, this was unimaginable. Foreigner was Lou's voice. The band without him was compared by critics to The Doors without Jim Morrison. Music. Foreigner continued to feature several new vocalists, but let's face it, no one can beat Lou Gramm as a jukebox hero. And that dismissal simply proved something crazy, even if he occasionally returned for reunions. Even the voices you believed to be inviolable could be silenced in rock. It's insane that someone would look at Lou Gramm and say, "Yeah, we can do without him." That's why I still shake my head every time I hear Double Vision today. Peter Rivera's Rare Earth. Music. Clapping applause. Music. Remember Rare Earth? They made you want to move with their groovy rock music. In the early 70s, songs like I Just Want to Celebrate and Get Ready were all over the place. It would be impossible to attend a pub or picnic without listening to one of those tunes. The most unusual aspect was that Pete Rivera, their drummer, doubled as the band's main singer. In the past. Pun intended. But things became complicated as the decade went on. Rivera made his debut with the management and the band. They showed him the door at the age of 74. Is that even possible? Removing the voice that contributed to all of their greatest singles. For many of us, that band was Peter Rivera, even though Rare Earth continued to exist without him. I still can't hear the word celebrate without imagining him hammering the drums and beaming as if he was having a great time. Steve Perry's journey. Next up, we have Steve Perry, the band that made smooth rock a stadium event and the driving force behind their success. You couldn't avoid his voice if you were a teenager in the late 70s with a driver's license. It had a range that seemed to defy gravity and was smooth, heartfelt, and pure gold. Songs such as Love and Touch and Squeezing and Wheel in the Sky. Not only did they dominate the charts, but they also became the background music for a lot of our lives. Journey was more than just a band by the time Escape released Don't Stop Believing in 1981, they were a household name. They were formerly a rock jam band from Prague, but it was his voice that made them the arena rock kings. The wheel in the sky continues to turn. Right now, I'm not sure. Indeed, you are correct. Although the official breakup occurred somewhat later in the mid-1980s, Journey's story is so intertwined with Perry's ascent and decline that it almost feels like a rock saga from the 1970s. Perry and the band first parted ways in 1987. Perry was worn out and in need of a vacation following a lengthy tour for their album, Raised on Radio. But the rest of the band was ready to return to the road. Additionally, Perry's ongoing health problems, specifically a degenerative hip condition and the stress of his traveling schedules, caused a rift that was unbridgeable beyond his hips. After a few years, Jury's hip problems reappeared, but he did finally get back together with Perry for the album Trial by Fire in the mid-1990s. Additionally, the band gave him an ultimatum when he refused to tour without having a hip replacement. Get a tour and get surgery, or they'll replace him. Steve Perry was also absent. You may change the vocalists all you want, but Journey without Steve Perry doesn't seem authentic to me. Nobody else had the special ability to strike those unachievable high notes squarely in your chest. Terry Latrella and Aereo Speedwagon. Music. Aereo Speedwagon was simply another tenacious Midwestern rock band attempting to find their own in the early 70s, but most people now associate them with the Eights ballads, such as Keep on Loving You and Can't Fight This Feeling. And Terry Latrell was the man in front before Kevin Cronin showed up. He helped make Aereo famous and had the pipes and the style. Unfortunately, Terry didn't last. Music. He and guitarist Gary Richrath were at odds with each other by 1972. Latrell was kicked out of the organization because of the intensity of the fighting. It turned out to be a godsend for the band, of course. We all know what happened when Cronin took control. However, you have to acknowledge that it's crazy to believe that Aereo's voice was cut before anyone even realized what was going to happen. Starship Jefferson, Marty Balon. Recall the late 70s. There was Jefferson Starship everywhere. Runaway, Miracles, Trust Me. Radio playlists were stuck with those tracks. And Marty Balon played a major role in that sound. There was a softer romantic element to Starship because of the mellow, soulful, even dreamy sound of his voice. In particular, Miracles had a pristine atmosphere in that track. However, the environment behind the scenes wasn't very good. Marty was tired by 1978. The band's tension, the never-ending tours, and the sense that his contributions were being overlooked. I'll be there for you, girl. After Earth, everything simply piled up, and he formally left. However, sources claimed that it felt more like he was being forced out, frozen until he was no longer able to remain. Later on, Marty said that he had become weary of the group's ego conflicts. And this hurt a lot of fans. He was dubbed the Jefferson Starship's heart by critics. Additionally, the band lent more towards the polished arena rock realm without that warm, emotive vocal. Many old-school fans thought the band's soul was gone, even though they continued to score singles in the 1980s. Music snubbed Marty's microphone until the audience forgot he was there. You can understand why his absence left such a void even today if you invoke Miracles. It's more than just a song. No one else in Starship could make the sound that Marty Balon was using to rap you. Bob Welch and Fleetwood Mac. Music. There was Bob Welch before Lindsey Buckingham and Stevie Nicks made Fleetwood Mac one of the world's greatest bands. He led the group through albums like Heroes Are Hard to Find and Mystery to Me, and is credited with keeping them together in the early 1970s. However, things were less relaxed behind the scenes by 1974. It was lonely for Welch. The band as a whole was desperate for a change. Music. Mick Fleetwood has acknowledged that Bob was essentially shoved aside to give Buckingham and Nick space. What a difficult break. Just as the ship hits gold, you managed to keep it floating before being thrown overboard. Despite Fleetwood Mac's meteoric rise to fame, many fans never forgot the Bob Welch years. The band might not have made it without him, even though he might not have been present for the rumors. Tears, Sweat, and Blood. Al Kooper. The spinning wheel continued to revolve after Capture Painted Pony left. Next, there was a name that was even mentioned in the story. Blood, Sweat, and Tears was founded by Al Kooper. Kooper was a real chameleon of music now. He started the Blues Project and played organ on Bob Dylan's classic song Like a Rolling Stone. The man's voice, which was raw, soulful, and a little gritty, was ideal for his most recent band concept, which combined jazz, horns, and rock. Indeed, it was successful. Rolling Child is Father to the Man, their 1968 debut, was a critical favorite. It felt like rock music had finally attended college because it was cool and smart. The plot, however, takes a somewhat sinister turn at this point. The band's other members, especially the horn players, desired more creative influence after the album was produced. The tension was simply too much, and Kooper, the visionary, wanted to keep artistic control. Additionally, Kooper was abruptly kicked out of the band he founded in 1968, right before they were set to become famous. However, I have no idea what it is. David Clayton Thomas, Cooper's replacement, joined the band and sang lead on their second self-titled album, which went on to win a Grammy and sell 4 million copies. With classics like You've Made Me So Very Happy and Spinning Wheel, it was an enormous hit that sent them into the sky. The man who came up with the idea was gone by the time the majority of us heard them on the radio. "I was the best fired person in rock and roll history," Cooper later jokingly remarked. It serves as a sobering reminder that sometimes the fireworks are invisible to even the brilliant person who ignites the fuse. Dave Alexander, The Stooges. Cheers, The Stooges never played on radio. You were unaware that I Want to Be Your Dog was positioned between Fleetwood Mac and the Eagles. You're not with Bob Welch. However, Dave Alexander's headquarters served as the unifying factor in the underground pandemonium. He was present when the band essentially created punk before the term was even used. But Dave's departure was a complete rock and roll disaster. He was so inebriated when he performed at the Goose Lake Festival in 1970 that he was unable to play. Iggy Pop abruptly spun around and sacked him in front of the crowd in mid-set. Imagine being kicked out of the band in front of thousands of fans in real time. Oh no. Embarrassing. Alexander never returned. That onstage dismissal was one of the most savage and spectacular exits in the history of rock and roll in the 1970s, even if the Stooges continued to perform. There you have it. All of the voices we believed to be invincible were being kicked out of their own bands. Some, like Ozzy, rode that mad roller coaster all the way to solo celebrity and came back stronger than ever. Others, however, vanished into the distance, allowing us to speculate as to what could have happened had they remained. In any case, it demonstrates how incredible the music scene of the 1970s was. You're blasting from every station in town one day, and then you're out on the street with your microphone stand the next. Which of these firings, in your opinion, shocked you the most at the time? After the changeover, did you continue to be a member of the band? Or did you remain faithful to the departing singer? This is crucial now.